Good morning, everybody that is with us on the webinar. Welcome to Library Research Week. My name is Hela Marie. I'm the faculty librarian at Theology Library, and my colleague Alvina Mattia from the Medical Library will also assist me in the chairing of the session. You are always welcome to put your hand up and ask a question or type your question in the chat. So our speaker today is Dr. Cindy Steenkamp, and let me just get there. Sorry, I just need to get to the actual slide, which you have shown me. She is a senior lecturer in the Political Science Department and research associate at the Center for International and Comparative Politics, CICP, at Stellenbosch University. She is the principal investigator of the World's Values Survey in South Africa and the South African Elite Opinion Leader Survey. Her research interest includes comparative international politics, political behavior, political culture, and democratization. Dr. Steenkamp specialized in research design and methodology with a focus on quantitative and survey research. She is the co-author of a book, several journal articles, research report, and occasional papers, and has presented her research at many national and international conferences. She is also a member of various international research projects in the global north and has extensive research networks on the African continent. She has taught modules and short courses in Introduction to Quantitative Research Skills, especially SPSS, in her department since 2009 and at the African Doctoral Academy since 2011. So thank you, Dr. Steenkamp, for addressing us today. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Hela. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this session, really on just an introduction to quantitative research, as well as an introduction to SPSS, which is a quantitative data analysis and research software program. I am a self-confessed data nerd. I love everything about numbers, their structure and their organization. But particularly, I love how the speed with which I can use numbers to prove or disprove an hypothesis. However, I wanted to stress that I'm not a statistician, nor am I a maths guru. What you've heard through the introduction is that I'm a social scientist. I'm a political scientist. And I was introduced to SPSS in a research methods course during my honors year. And since then, I've just really developed such a love for quantitative research. So I'm going to switch my camera off and I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. Right, so as you all know, quantitative research is pretty much, it's a numbers thing, right? So what it does is it allows us to learn a lot more about and to understand the social world around us. What quantitative research allows us to do is it allows us to quantify, I mean, predominantly human, but it could also be used for non-human behavior, but definitely human perceptions, human attitudes, interests, beliefs. And that's because it produces objective data, which we can then analyze and communicate through the use of numbers and statistics. However, numbers and statistics do tend to scare a lot of researchers, especially those in the humanities and some of the social sciences. And this is exactly where a software package like SPSS really becomes wonderful when considering embarking on quantitative research. So what is SPSS? SPSS is an acronym. It stands for the Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. It's a very complex data package. It offers data management, statistical analysis, as well as graphics options. While I'll introduce you to some of the graphics options a bit later, I must be honest, I still prefer doing my graphs in Excel, but producing the data in SPSS. Some people may know SPSS through a different acronym, PASW. It's not as commonly known, but SPSS was bought out by IBM a few years ago, and some people refer to it as predictive analytical software. Now, SPSS is a software program. It deals with numbers. It wants statistics. That's what it feeds off. But I want to stress that you absolutely do not need to be a statistician to use SPSS. The great thing about using a data software program like SPSS is that it's going to do all the heavy lifting in terms of the quant work for you, right? What you need to be able to learn is, well, what does SPSS want? What does it need? How does it analyze the data? And then once it produces the answer for you, once it produces the output for you, how then do you utilize that output? How do you then explain those results to either your reader or explain those results to your examiner? Now, of course, if we think about the research process, and this applies to those of us embarking on master's theses, PhD dissertations, or even researchers with particular research papers and projects we're busy with, we know that data collection and data analysis are two very important steps within that research process. The data collection process for me is arguably probably the most important step, because if you're going to collect nonsense data, then your data analysis is going to yield nonsense, right? So it's incredibly important that you understand the full research process, that you're thinking about exactly how you want to analyze this data and the purpose of the data before you even go into the field to start doing data collection. Because we all know that our research question is what actually determines the appropriate research methodology. If you have research questions that are looking at the correlation between A and B, or the relationship between A, B, and C, or the effect of A, B, C, and D on E, for example, these words, correlation, influence, impact, relationship, these all infer some type of statistical significance. So that means then that in terms of our methodology, we would need to do some kind of quantitative data analysis. Of course, the data collection, we think about how we collect the data, and I'll go through in a moment a number of sources of data. Some of us will be doing secondary data analysis. Some of us will be doing primary data collection. So what happens when you're doing primary data collection, and this is predominantly through something like surveys, for example, you are going to construct a survey, a questionnaire, where you're going to ask respondents a number of questions, and these responses will largely be closed-ended responses where you have predetermined what the response should be, and then the respondent indicates what their answer is. Some of us, though, will not collect primary data. What we could perhaps use, for example, is secondary data sources. This could be, if you're in the medical or health sciences, going through patient files, for example, and extracting data from those. If you are in the agri-sciences and you think of some of the data that's available in labs that have already undergone testing but now need to be fed, and perhaps you can utilize that in a secondary way. The point is that what SPSS needs to function optimally as a stats package, it needs numbers, it needs raw data. So where does this data come from? Well, data is available all around us. I think we'll all agree that the world has moved into zeros and ones, and there's an abundance of resources that we can tap into available. Most universities, but as well as countries, have what we call data archives, for example, where many social and natural scientists will conduct research projects, and then they will actually upload those data sets to the archives for use by other researchers. This is always fantastic for comparability, for example, but also because it sometimes happens that researchers collect so much data that they can't always use all of it themselves. So they're able to make that publicly available so that other researchers may also have access to that data. When we think about quantitative research, though, where this data comes from, I am a specialist in survey research, so I have a lot of experience with conducting survey research, so collecting primary data, where we have questionnaires that we pilot, and then that we actually go out into the field with large sample sizes. Of course, these days, we know that primary data collection, especially if you plan on doing primary data collection on a face-to-face basis, can be incredibly expensive. So we now have alternative options where you can conduct online surveys. You can use apps such as SurveyMonkey, for example. I know that the university itself has a survey application. I'm sure you've all received in your inboxes from time to time requests from higher degree students who would like respondents for their MA thesis or their PhD dissertation studies. So data is available. Obviously, if you're collecting primary data, you have a lot more agency in terms of you get to decide how many questions are asked. You get to decide what questions are asked. You get to decide what are those response categories for each of those questions. When we're doing secondary data analysis, unfortunately, the data has already been collected. So in this case, you will have to work with the questions and the response categories as they were collected. This doesn't mean then that it's not useful. Many people use secondary data sources that have very high levels of reliability and validity, statistic validity. It's just that you can't specifically mold and shape that particular data set to your research question per se. But data is around us, and I'm happy to share as well some information, perhaps at the end, around useful archives that you can use to explore to see what kind of quantitative data is available in your particular area of research. Just there we go. So when we think about really the foundation of quantitative data analysis, I always come back in my workshops and short courses to talk about stats. We need statistics. We need numbers, right? So SPSS needs numbers to function optimally. SPSS being a stats program, it cannot conduct analysis to see the differences between, for example, master students and PhD students. Those words, master students and PhD students, mean absolutely nothing to SPSS. But what SPSS does understand is the difference between 1 and 2. So what this essentially means is that every question that we ask respondents, we can refer to as a variable, right? That's a variable or a question or an indicator. And every type of variable will have will represent a particular level of measurement. Now, in order to determine the level of measurement or the type of variable, we don't look at the question that is posed to respondents. What we do is we look at the response categories. The response categories will indicate to us what the level of measurement is of that particular variable or that particular question. Because of course, when we are analyzing data, I'm not analyzing the questions. What we're doing is we are analyzing the respondents' responses. Now, when you look at the literature, when it comes to levels of measurement, there are 4 types of variables or 4 types of kind of questions that are identified. We talk about nominal variables, ordinal variables, interval variables, as well as ratio variables. And all 4 of these levels of measurement have various characteristics. I'm going to not go into detail on this particular slide because maybe I can have a look. I'm going to skip one ahead. What you'll notice here in SPSS is that there are only 3 types of variables. We talk about nominal variables, ordinal variables, and scale variables. So essentially what happens is in the literature, you have interval and ratio over here, but SPSS cannot actually determine the difference between interval and ratio variables, and I'll explain that to you in a moment. So that's why we combine them to talk about scale variables. So when you think about having a survey, you have a research project, you know what you essentially or ultimately what you would like to do with that data, you know how you would like to analyze the data, what your research question is. That, of course, is going to influence how you ask respondents a question. Because if you want to do very sophisticated data analysis, you need to, and multiple regressions, for example, and you want to look at perhaps linear and logic regressions, you would need to work with a particular type of variable. You can't do that sophisticated statistical analysis with all of these types of variables. So that's why the absolute foundational step of working with SPSS and thinking about any type of quantitative research is being able to adequately identify the level of measurement, whether that's nominal, ordinal, or scale. So I'm going to run through with you the difference between these 3. Now, nominal variables are what we can actually refer to as our most basic variable type. So nominal variables are where we would ask a respondent a question. We would say, if there was a national election tomorrow, for which party would you vote? And then you will see that there's a number of response categories. I happen to just list 12 here, from the United Democratic Movement all the way down to Pan-Africanist Congress. So what the respondent does is they find their political party that they would vote for on their list. So they said, well, it's the Inkatha Freedom Party, and they would mark off that that's the party they would vote for, the IFP. So what you'll see here is that you have a question, you have 12 response categories, and those 12 response categories are words. So the response, the answers are in a word format: United Democratic Movement, Economic Freedom Fighters. SPSS doesn't understand the difference between the United Democratic Movement or the EFF. So what we do as the researcher on the back end, we need to assign these artificial numeric values to each response category. So with nominal variables, what we do is we know that that the response is a word response category. We know that SPSS doesn't understand words. So 2, we need to assign artificial numeric values. With nominal variables, when we assign those artificial numeric values, they are what we call arbitrary. I simply, if there are 12 response categories, I start at 1 and I end at 12. And that's because in this particular example, there is no fixed order. All that those 12 numbers, 1 through to 12, are doing is signaling to me, the researcher, and to SPSS that there were 12 different response categories. Another example of a nominal question, for example, is sex of respondent. Here we have 3 response categories: male, female, non-binary. SPSS doesn't understand the words male, female, non-binary. So we assign artificial numeric values 1, 2, and 3. All those values do is show that there are 3 different response categories. It would make no difference at all if you are planning your questionnaire and you have a question sex of respondent and you have female, male, non-binary, and you choose to code those 1, 2, and 3, or 0, 1, and 2, Or you could say female is 55, male is 673, and non-binary is 2. It would have absolutely no influence or impact on your analysis because you simply need 3 numbers to show that you have 3 different response categories. Of course, it does make sense to just start from 1, 2, and 3, but I leave that up to you. It will still work. Another example I have here for of a nominal variable is when we just ask respondents a lot of their demographics. What is your religion, if any? No religion, Roman Catholic, Protestant, all the way down to traditional or ethnic religions. In that particular example, once again, you see that there are 9 response categories. So I just simply assign each response category an artificial numeric value 1 through to 9. I should perhaps stress that when I am conducting this particular survey with respondents, if I were to do it face-to-face, or if I were doing it online, I would not include those artificial numeric values. Those would stand as empty boxes or options where your respondents could either in person cross off or online they could tick as their particular response category. But of course, when you are constructing your survey, you need to know, for example, what you need to identify as you are developing your questionnaire, the level of measurement. And also, if you've identified that, yes, this is a nominal variable, you know that as a nominal variable, where the response categories are words, you need to assign an artificial numeric value. So you would see those numbers on your end as the researcher, but a respondent wouldn't see those. In terms of nominal variables, the only other thing I should tell you is that all dichotomous variables, so that is questions where there are only 2 response categories. So if I ask, are you making good progress on your master's study? Yes, no. There are 2 response categories, yes and no. Yes, 1, 2, no. So where you only have 2 response categories, all variables where there are only 2 response categories, they are nominal. Dichotomous variables are always nominal. Kirshna, you'll let me know if we have any questions as we go. Please do ask questions throughout if need be. Otherwise, I'll move on. Now, the second type of variable that SPSS recognizes is what we call an ordinal variable. Now, in the social sciences, for sure, ordinal variables are the most popular type of variables. And there's a particular type of ordinal variable that is popular. That's what we call a Likert scale. And I'll give you an example and I'll talk about that in a few moments. What you'll notice about ordinal variables is that very much like nominal variables, ordinal variables, you ask a respondent a question. A university education is more important for a boy than a girl. And respondents are then asked to indicate whether they strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So similar to nominal variables, you'll see that those response categories are words, right? They're a worded response. So we know the first step, SPSS does not understand the difference between strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So we assign artificial numeric values to those response categories. There are 4, so I assign 4 response categories, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The difference, however, between nominal and ordinal variables is that with nominal variables, the most basic type, nominal variable, it means there is no fixed order, right? So if we go back, we look, there was no fixed order, there was just a number of response categories. With ordinal variables, there is a fixed order. There is a reason why strongly agree comes before agree and why strongly disagree comes after disagree. So in this particular example about university education being more important for a boy than a girl, you'll see that you have your 2 strongest responses, strongly agree and strongly disagree, on the outer ends. and then you have agree and disagree flanking them on either side in the middle. So there is a fixed order in these response categories. We're going from agree the most strongly to agree to disagree most strongly. We also take a look at this example on the bottom, where we say, how would you describe the economic condition in Kenya? Very bad, fairly bad, neither bad or good, fairly good, very good. So if I'm trying to determine the level of measurements, the first thing I look at is, are there worded response categories? The answer is yes, there are. I know SPSS doesn't understand those words, so we assign artificial numeric values. There are 5 response categories, so I have 5 artificial numeric values. Now I must determine, is there a fixed order, yes or no? And in this example, there is indeed a fixed order. I'm going from very bad through to very good. Now, this particular type of question is what we refer to as a Likert scale, Likert. And a Likert scale is probably one of the most popular, probably one of the most famous, most utilized ways of asking an ordinal variable. What makes this a Likert scale is that I have 5 response categories, and the third category must be a neither or a neutral category. So for example, I could also have rephrased this to say strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, strongly disagree, or even invert that the other way around. So when you have the 5 response categories with a neither or a neutral in the middle, that's what we call Likert scales, which are incredibly popular. If we look at the bottom here, the bottom right-hand side, how often do you listen to the radio? Every day, a few times a week, a few times a month, less than once a month. Again, you have the worded response category. SPSS doesn't understand words. We assign an artificial numeric value. Is there a fixed order? In this case, yes, there is a fixed order. We're going from most frequently listened to through to least frequently. Then, of course, at the top, we have a question. It's one of the demographics where we often ask our field workers just to identify what is the size of the town or community in which you collected this data. So here, these responses look slightly different because here you'll see you have 6 response categories, but these are not worded response categories. Those are, in fact, numbers. So if SPSS is a stats program and it likes numbers, why can it not just work with those? Why is it that we've assigned then 6 artificial numeric values? And the simple answer is because if we are dealing with one response category, SPSS assigns 1 artificial numeric value to each. In this particular instance, do you see how we're not working with one number, but rather we're working with a range? And so because SPSS cannot go into category 2 and identify or highlight or pull out those respondents that live in a town or community with only 678 respondents, that is why we assign an artificial numeric value, right? Because this is a range. You're working with more than one number. Of course, here we would have to assign artificial numeric values, and we can also see that this is a fixed order. We're going from least populated to most populated. Another example of this type of ordinal variable, of course, is when respondents, if you're asking respondents about their age, for whatever reason, if you think that they would be too sensitive to ask it as an open-ended question where you say, how old are you? We often see that people have age ranges where they would say, are you between the ages of 18 to 24, or 25 to 39, or 40 to 59. That's another example of those ranges. There's a fixed order going from youngest to oldest, but SPSS can't work with those ranges. It needs one number to analyze. I can't quantify one number from that range, and so that's why we assign an artificial numeric value. I should also just perhaps tell you that if you take this question over here, a university education is more important for a boy than a girl, you'll see that it is an ordinal variable, because I have worded response categories, I've assigned artificial numeric values, and there's a fixed order. However, if you have somebody who is collecting the data for you, or perhaps who is setting up the questionnaire for you, and they asked the same question, but they provided these response categories in a different order. They said, for example, 1 is agree, 2 is disagree, 3 is strongly disagree, and 4 is strongly agree. Then I could still work with that data. It's a worded response. I have 4 response categories, but in that example, these responses have lost their fixed order. They had no order. So if they have no order, then I would analyze it the same that I would a nominal variable. So as soon as I lose this order, then these variables essentially become nominal variables because there is no fixed order. So that's the second type of variable in that SPSS recognizes, or level of measurement. There is one more level of measurement, and that is what we call scale variables. And scale variables, for me, are always the easiest to recognize, because this is where we ask a respondent a question, and the response to those questions are already true numeric values. So for example, we can ask respondents, can you tell me your year of birth? And they would give us a number, the year of birth. Oh, I should actually change that 19 now. There's many of our respondents who are now born in the 2000s. Age, of course, is a very popular question. How old are you? And someone would just give you their age in years. You can ask people to indicate how many people reside in your household. How many children do you have, for example? So those are all examples where I ask a respondent a question and the response is already a number. It's a true numeric value. So we do not have to assign an artificial numeric value. If a respondent is 19 years old, 19 means 19. And also SPSS understands what 19 means. Of course, those are very straightforward type of scale variables. They would become, they are very popular, especially in the natural sciences. If you think of laboratory work and the health sciences, where you're taking things like temperature and weight and height and BMI, and, those are all already in numeric format. So that means when you input them into SPSS, you know that these are already scale variables. We don't have to assign an artificial numeric value. In the social sciences, though, you'll find that we often ask some questions in this way, where we specifically want the responses to be answered on a 10-point scale. We want the level of measurement to be a scale variable. And the reason why we want the variable to be a scale variable is because, of course, when you are working with variables that are already true numeric values, it means that you can do the most sophisticated statistical analysis with these type of variables. So if you are looking to go on to do quite a lot of inferential statistics, if you want to go on to do regressions and so on, then you would want to work with these scale variables. The scale, the true numeric variables, are the most robust. So how would we ask that question then? We would often say in political matters, people talk of the left and the right. Where would you place your views on this scale, generally speaking, where 1 means left and 10 means right? And then we have these 10 response categories. Response category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Then the respondent would mark off where they fit on the scale, if it be a 7 or a 1 or a 3 or a 9, so be it. So some people will say to me, but what is confusing me is that at response category 1, it says left, and at response category 10, it says right. And those are words. So why is that then not ordinal? And I say to them, the reason is because when you are presenting your respondents with a scale like this, when you say on a 10-point scale where 1 means left and 10 means right, you need to, very importantly, let your respondents know in which direction is the scale running. So another example would be if I had to ask my respondents, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? Where 1 means completely dissatisfied and 10 means completely satisfied. So I always let them know the 1 and the 10, the minimum and the maximum value, what those two would represent, because what that does is it tells us in which direction the scale is running, so that I know that if my respondents are marking 2, then they are all very clear that 2 means that they are more left orientated. Whereas others, if I don't tell them what the 1 and the 10 means, they may just assume, for example, that 1 is right and 10 is left. So these would be examples of scale variables. It doesn't always have to be the bottom one. It doesn't always have to be a 10-point scale. I've seen many researchers use 5 or 7-point scales. And this often will depend on particular disciplines, but the principle remains the same. The reason why I like to work with 10-point scales personally is because it's very respondent friendly, right? So I use nationally representative data. So we find that when you use a scale that runs from 1 to 10, it's something that all respondents are able to respond with ease. It's far more respondent friendly than perhaps a 7-point scale. So those are the 3 types of variables. Those are the 3 levels of measurement that we use in quantitative research. Those are the 3 types of variables that SPSS understands. It does take a little bit of practice to identify the levels of measurement. And what I used to do is I would just ask myself always 2 questions when determining the level of measurement. I'd first ask myself, is the response category a number? Because if the answer is yes, then fantastic. That means that this variable is a scale variable. But if the answer is no, then I know, okay, it's not scale, it must be nominal or ordinal. So then I ask myself a second question. I then say, are these response categories in a fixed order? If the answer is yes, then the variable is ordinal. If the answer is no, then I know that the answer is nominal. So that's the kind of the sort of how as I was, embarking on using SPSS, the 2 questions that I would ask myself to ensure that I'm correctly identifying the level of measurement. Did we have a question come through? Hayla? Okay, I will continue so long.
Excuse me, Cindy. It was actually a comment. There's Archie says 1 to 10 can be easily translated to percentages. That's just a comment, while you were talking about this 1 to 10 scale.
Yes.
Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you. Yes, Archie, that's correct. It's just it's a more intuitive way of understanding that scale as well. What you might see is, and it again, this may change depending on the discipline, is that when we are conducting analysis, when you are deciding on, all right, now I must embark on some univariate, bivariate, or multivariate analysis, and you've already identified your level of measurement, you might see that people talk about categorical variables and scale variables. Now, categorical variables are all of those variables where we, the researcher, have had to assign an artificial numeric value. So categorical variables are those where we have the worded response and we've assigned an artificial numeric value for SPSS. So that's nominal and ordinal variables. So if you talk about categorical variables, you know then that it's either nominal or ordinal. These can also be referred to as qualitative variables. And the reason why we often group these together, just in terms of explanation, is that these categorical variables, whether it's nominal or ordinal, often have the same method of analysis when it comes to univariate analysis. Where you have scale variables, true numeric variables, these are often referred to as well as discrete or continuous variables. I've also seen them referred to as quantitative variables because they have true numeric values. The one interesting thing as well is that SPSS is very robust. We can identify these levels of measurement as they presented to us, how we've asked the question, or how the question was asked previously, and we're about to analyze that using secondary data analysis. We are actually able to manipulate these levels of measurement. And what I mean by that is that there's a technique called recoding, where we can actually recode that scale variable, and by recoding it, it then actually becomes a categorical variable. So for example, if I was going to now, I want to capture the marks for my second year students. And so what I do is I now enter all of their marks as a percentage. So they're going to receive a percentage of somewhere between 0 and 100. When I enter those marks will already be in numeric format. It's going to be a 23 or a 76 or an 89, whatever the case may be. So it's a scale variable, right? And SPSS is able to do the most robust type of analysis with those scale variables, the true numeric values. But it might be, for example, that I don't want to use those true numeric values to identify the average and the mode and look at the dispersion, the standard deviation. All my HOD actually wants to know is they've just said to me, Cindy, how many passed and how many failed? So what I could do is I could say, okay, well, I now then want a new variable that only has 2 response categories, pass and fail. Now remember, SPSS doesn't understand the difference between pass and fail, but it does understand the difference between 1 and 2. So there is a technique in SPSS where I can actually say, SPSS, take all of those students who received an assessment score of between 0 and 49 and put them in one group for me, please. And that is those who failed. Then I want you to take everybody who achieved between 50 and 100%, put them in a second category called pass. And then, of course, I've now moved from a scale variable where I have hundreds of percentages into a nominal variable, actually a dichotomous variable, because there's now only 2 response categories, fail and pass. So SPSS is very robust. I'm able to manipulate and recode these variables depending on what my particular research question and the research need is. However, I should stress that it is impossible for you to collect categorical data. So to collect data in a worded form, for example, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then convert that into some kind of true numeric value. That is impossible to do. So another way I could have captured data, I could have said the first time around, I'm just interested to know, did the student pass or fail? So for each of my 300 students, I would have assigned them a score of either 1, they failed, or 2, they passed. That's a dichotomous variable. I only have 2 response categories. Do you see how if then my HOD says to me, but Cindy, what was the average percentage? What was the distribution? There is no ways on earth I can move from a pass and a fail to a scale variable that suddenly converts into 300 different percentages. So the recoding is always wonderful to use, but we do that after the data collection. The best is always to collect as much data as possible that takes into account enough type of variation amongst respondents. You can always then recode and collapse categories like strongly and agree into one category and disagree and strongly disagree afterwards. But the point is we want as much data as possible because you are not going to get far quantitatively if all of your variables are dichotomous, for example, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. There's not much statistical significance that can be drawn from those responses because there's very little variation. That means that there's a high degree that the patterns that you see emanating from the data, they simply occurred by chance because, well, respondents could only go one of two ways. So thinking about and being able to identify these levels of measurement, this nominal, ordinal, and scale, does become very important because it determines the type of statistical analysis that you will end up being able to do. Of course, where you have true numeric variables, scale variables, that are your most robust, but you can also do very sophisticated analysis with your ordinal and your nominal variables that have those worded categories where you've assigned an artificial numeric value. So how then does SPSS work? The good news is that Stellenbosch University actually has an institutional license, SPSS license, and it is renewable annually. So if you are a staff member with an asset number for your PC, or if you are a registered student, you can actually just log into the IT hub. You can put in a request for the SPSS software, and you'll be able to download that, and you're also provided with the licensing codes. So that's an incredible feature that we have being affiliated with Stellenbosch University. The license does update annually. I think it's in September. You can then continue to use SPSS for the month of October. Every time you log on, it will tell you you have 29 days, you have 27 days, you have 26 days left. And then within that month, you can just upgrade or renew the license again through the IT hub. So please, I do encourage you, even if you're just thinking about using SPSS, download the software and please do play around with it. I promise you your PC won't explode. There is an open source, let me say, not version, but there is a similar open source software. It's called R. I know R is, very widely used in North America as well as in Europe, but I still continue to use SPSS. And the reason for that is that I find, especially for beginners, those like initially embarking on quantitative research and analysis, SPSS to me is far more user-friendly than the open source program R. And as you are all affiliated at the university, it won't cost you anything to download the software. So SPSS has three file types that you should know about. The most significant, or the file type you will use always, is what we call the data file. And the extension of that file is a .sav file. And the data file is very similar in a way to an Excel spreadsheet, in that if you look at the top diagram here, you'll see this is an example of what a data file looks like. It's a .sav, there it is. And of course, we see all of these numbers here. So that's why I say it's quite similar. It looks a bit familiar because it seems to mimic Excel. The thing about your data file in SPSS is that it's far more sophisticated than Excel, because what your data file has is it carries two viewpoints. You have your data view, but you also have your variable view. So you have two tabs, very similar to the number of tabs you have on Excel, but they're not never ending. In SPSS, you only have two views. Now, when it comes to your data view, and in this particular example, I'm standing on the data view because it's gray, it's highlighted. There are only three things that you need to know about your data view. The first thing is that your data view carries the raw data, okay? SPSS, remember, it needs to do statistical analysis. So in order to do that analysis, it needs numbers. That's our raw data. Here it is. The second thing you need to remember is that every row in your data view represents a different respondent. So if you have 300 rows, that means that you have 300 respondents. The third thing you need to remember about the data view is every column represents a different variable. All right, so if you move across in this particular example, there are 389 columns. That means for this questionnaire, there were 389 variables or questions. So that's your data view. Only 3 things to remember. Raw data, every row represents a respondent, every column represents a variable. Very similar to Excel. But what sets SPSS apart is that the second tab is what we call a variable view. And in that variable view, that is where we capture all the information necessary about each variable. So there are a number of categories that we see at the top of this variable view. So you'll see that in the very first row, oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, the very first column, that is where we capture the name of the variable, right? Very importantly, your variable name cannot start with a number. What I like to do is if I have 300 questions in my questionnaire, it would be quite nice just to start saying, well, I'm going to call them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through to 300. Unfortunately, SPSS doesn't allow us to do that. The name may not start with a number. So to keep it short and sweet, what I like to do is I simply like to use an acronym Q for question or V for variable. And if I have 300 questions, I simply name them V1 or Q1 through to V300 or Q300. So I keep the name very, very short, and I like to have that correlation between the variable name as well as the questionnaire. This becomes easy for me to detect then as well if there are any data capturing and entry problems. The second type, second in our variable view, is that as soon as you enter a variable name, SPSS will populate some default positions. Now, of course, if you want to do statistical analysis, the default type of variable is going to be a numeric variable. But you will see in this particular example that we do have something called string over here. And string refers to actual words, to letters. SPSS can, in fact, capture worded responses. So for example, if I wanted to capture a respondent's name, then yes, I can enter people's names, Cindy or Lungile or Asante. Those I can, SPSS will hold that data. However, SPSS won't be able to do any statistical analysis with a string variable. Those would be for descriptive purposes where I would want to assign particular features to a particular respondent. SPSS is also quite sophisticated in terms of the type, in that what I can also do, and I think what I'm going to do here is to make it a little bit easier for you, I would like to just open a blank SPSS file. I just need to do that for you so you can see. Just give me a moment, please. Share screen. There we go. So this is what a blank SPSS file would look like. I have my data view and my variable view, but it's not populated. So at the name, if I had to give the V1 and say enter, you see you have these generic, the default settings that pop up. The default is always going to be numeric, that you're working with numbers. But SPSS, if you click on the right-hand side, it does give you alternative options. So if you're working with a particular scientific notation or a date, string is where we would capture those letters. But in terms of date, you'll also see you have a number of options that you are able to use here. Of course, whatever option you select, you will need to make sure that you capture the data in exactly that same format, the day, dash, month, and year. The next column is width, and you can absolutely ignore the width. What that actually refers to is saying that the biggest number that SPSS can work with then is 999999999. So that's 8 digits. It's probably unlikely that you're going to deal with a number or capture a data in your data view that is bigger than that. But if you do, if you're working with very massive numbers, you simply then just increase the width. In all the years I've been working with big data, I've never had to increase the width. Second is the decimals, this column over here. The default is that it will produce all your output with 2 decimal points. But if you have no decimals and you're not interested in that, you can simply switch them off, or you can increase depending on what your particular discipline requires. The label category is very important because what the label does is this tells us what is this variable actually measuring. Up until this point, all we knew that was variable 1. We know that it's numeric and there's going to be 4 decimals, but we don't actually know but what is it measuring. And so what I like to do is I like to copy and paste from the questionnaire. And let's just pretend that for this particular question, it is age of respondents. And there is no way around this. It needs to be typed in. You can copy and paste. Unfortunately, you cannot copy and paste long lists, though. They have to be dealt with individually, each individual variable. The next column is values. And of course, this column becomes very important when we are working with artificial numeric values. So where this variable is either nominal or it's ordinal, it means that we have assigned artificial numeric values to those response categories. This values column is where I need to tell SPSS how I've assigned those artificial numeric values. For this particular example, it's age of respondents. So I'm just going to pretend I'm asking age as a scale variable. You would give me the age. So I don't then need to add in any values. SPSS understands already those values. But what I do need to do is, the last thing I need to do is under measure, I'm just going to tell SPSS there's a drop down. That one is going to be a scale variable. Under missing, you'll see the default at the moment is none. The columns just refers to the spacing, so you can ignore that. And the alignment also is just a formatting issue. When it comes to none, we do have options later on when we are when we're also capturing data, where we talk about our non-response categories, right? So let me do just another quick example. If I had variable 2 is also going to be numeric, and I'm going to leave the default. And this has to do with level of study. And I'm going to pretend that for this particular sample, I only had 2 categories of students. My first category is those MA students, and I add. And my second category is going to be PhD students. And so, of course, I know that SPSS does not understand the difference between MA and PhD students. So I've assigned them artificial numeric values 1 and 2, and I say, OK. And then that populates into the values over there. Now, when I am capturing data, of course, I always want my respondents to answer every single question. But unfortunately, whether you're doing in-person interviews or if you're doing online surveys, I cannot force somebody to answer, right? So it might be that sometimes a respondent would say, refused to answer. That can be one option. Or they can say, I don't know. What I would do here is this, I still need to capture their response, right? But I never add it as now just a simple 3. Often what we'll do is we'll say that this is 999. And potentially what could also happen is someone could have said that they do not know. And this one I'm going to code as 998 and simply say, OK. Now we cannot leave a response category blank. So when it comes to a particular respondent, in the data view, there needs to be data in each cell for each respondent for each variable. If someone refused to answer or they did not know, I cannot simply leave it blank here. I'm going to assign an artificial numeric value to capture that. So I have assigned it in this case to 998 and 999. We do not use these non-response categories when determining the level of measurement, where something is nominal, ordinal, or scale. And what we will do is, before analysis, I'll often then say to SPSS, SPSS, before you conduct any analysis with that level, about the level of study, please go ahead and remove all of those respondents, or not remove, please ignore all of those who were indicated as a 999 or a 998. So essentially I'm saying only work with those who answered the question. So we are not deleting these respondents from the data set, but for this variable and this variable only, SPSS is only going to include those who answered the question, either 1 or 2. So what I'd also like to do with you quickly, I'm going to just show you so you can see what it looks like. Share screen here, what a completed data set looks like. Here's an example for you. So here's an example of one of the data sets that I work with. It's a nationally representative one. You'll see it always looks the same. My variable view, and I know I'm in the variable view because it's got all the information about my particular variable. And the first tab is always the data view. So this is what it looks like when it's populated, right? So remember, with the data view, captures the raw data. Every row represents the responses for a particular respondent. Every column represents a variable. So in this particular data set, if I scroll down in the data view, I can see, I'm keep going. In this particular data set, I had 3,531 respondents. And if I move all the way across in terms of the columns, I can see that for this particular variable as well, data set as well, I had 378 variables. We don't work in the data view. It can be quite overwhelming, even for myself, looking at all these numbers. I can't remember across almost 400 variables what each of these numbers mean. And so that's why the variable view becomes incredibly important. And this is what a completed SPSS data file would look like. Now you might have a little bit more appreciation for people who do your data capturing, because what you'll see is, for example, many of these were categorical variables. So this is where we had to tell SPSS how are these response categories coded. And for each, you'll see that there's also a don't know. But the style that SPSS asks us, do you see that it is not possible to copy and paste? If I was to add labels here, you can't copy and paste 1, 2, 3, 5 plus then the corresponding label. It needs every single artificial numeric value and its corresponding label needs to be captured individually. So it does take an incredible amount of time to capture your data in a workable data set. But it's very important that you don't take any shortcuts, because the more information that you have populated in your variable view, the easier your analysis will be. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So I'm going to go back to the slide so you can have a look. Okay. Okay. So this is the SAV folder that I've just showed you that carries the data and the variable views. SPSS, though, has another 2 file extensions. We talk about the instruction and the syntax file, as well as your output file. So the output file, that is automatically generated by SPSS. Anytime, once I've captured the data and I've fully populated both my data view and my variable view, I can go ahead and actually commence my analysis. And when I ask SPSS to do something in the data file, that .sav file, it opens up automatically. It generates what we call an output file, which here it's giving me my little stats box, and it's also providing a frequency, the list of response categories, plus then the number of respondents who answered and the percentages. So that's the output file that you work with. What I do is I keep my output file open and I continue to work. And what happens is that the output file just continues to populate all of the answers, all of the outputs. And that's a wonderful thing to have that in one place, because that means that I can scroll up and down to see, but what did I do previously? How is it different, for example? The third type of file that SPSS works with is what we call a syntax file or an instruction file. Now, this is wonderful to use once you are a more experienced user of SPSS. This means that instead of using the drop-down menus in your data view to generate that output, you can actually just start to, it sort of looks like code, and ask SPSS here in your syntax file to keep record. It is important to find out what your own disciplinary requirements are, because many top class journals often require you to provide your syntax file as well as your data set with a particular submission for publication. I also know with my own PhD, my own supervisors asked me to keep track of all of my data steps in a syntax file, and we sent the syntax file together with a copy of the data to the examiners so that they could just very easily copy and paste these instructions once they'd opened my data set, and then they could actually replicate my results to ensure that I did, in fact, conduct this analysis and I wasn't making up the data. It's not always required. Once you've been working with SPSS for a while, you know, and then you introduce this sort of syntax programming, it becomes very intuitive and it's very user-friendly, but it's not a place to start. So I only rely on my outputs in the beginning, and as you become more familiar, as you become more confident with this program, then of course you can dabble a little bit with the syntax. So how do you go ahead then and create your data set? You may have a number of questionnaires that are sitting on your table that you've now realized you can actually use what you have and you can create a quantitative data set. How do you capture the data? So there are two ways that you can do this. You can either capture the data directly into SPSS. And what I do is I open up that SAV file. And what I do is I first capture all the information about each variable in my variable view. And once that's done, I then have to rely on my big stack of 300 question papers. And what I do is I then go one for one, each respondent, and I capture their respective information in the data view. I then am able to save that .sav, that data file, and then I'm able to use that data file in order to conduct my analysis. A second way of capturing your data or creating a data set is that you may receive data. A lot of data archives, if you're going to conduct secondary data analysis, have this data available in Excel format, for example. So they'll upload the Excel spreadsheet, and then what they'll do is they'll have the questionnaire available for download. So it is possible for you to capture your data in Excel and then import it into SPSS. The limitation around the data capturing in Excel, though, is that you are limited to a total of 256 variables, because there are only 256 columns. Now, that's a lot. So it's probably a very user-friendly for many people to be able to use Excel. What then happens is you're able to import then that Excel spreadsheet into SPSS. But remember, all that then becomes populated in SPSS is the data view, right? Because Excel doesn't have a variable view. It only has those tabs. So then what happens is that you will open up your SPSS, you've pulled in the data to populate the data view, but then of course you still need to click on the variable view, and one for one, if you have 200 variables, you're going to need to then capture all the variable information for each of those 200 variables. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to just very briefly just show you then, once you have your data set up and running, what are some of the things that you can do with that data? And so, people are often, statistics, and you're like, oh, no, I don't think so. Statistics really is just, it's a set of collected numbers, right? And a lot of what we are doing using quantitative data is descriptive statistics, where we're quite simply describing the data and offering summary information to our readers. When it comes to actually conducting our statistical analysis, we must remember that this can also take place on a number of levels. You can conduct univariate analysis when I'm only doing an analysis using one variable. Bivariate is where I use two variables, and multivariate analysis is when I'm using 3 or more variables concurrently. When it comes to descriptive statistics, what I have here is a table for you that you can use either with the help of YouTube videos, which are fantastic as well. But I often say to my students, this is sort of my maroon Bible when we are starting off introduction to SPSS. When I have univariate analysis, so the analysis of one variable, there are only two types of analysis that I can do. I can either run a frequency or I can run summary statistics. So now how do I know when to do what? Well, the level of measurement, the type of variable will determine the appropriate method of analysis as well as method of visualization. If I have one categorical variable where it's only one nominal or ordinal variable, I would run a frequency. If I had one scale variable, I'm going to run summary statistics. As well, one categorical variable, I can do a pie or a bar chart, and it makes sense to use a histogram with a scale variable. So what I've shown you here is, this is what your output would look like, that output file in SPSS. On the left-hand side, this is an example of an ordinal variable where we ask respondents, how important is work in your life? And I had 4 response categories: very important, rather important, not very important, not at all important. There was those that said they did not know. There was 4.4% of them, but you can see that when I present this analysis, I'd said to SPSS, when it comes to this variable, please remove them from the analysis. Don't delete them. I can see them there, but then I'm going to read the valid percentage, right? And so this is a categorical variable. I've run a frequency, and I can just simply see what percentage of respondents answered each response category. The frequency column here refers to the actual number of respondents, but of course it always is more user-friendly to use your percentages. Very briefly, SPSS, the frequency table always looks like this: the percent and the valid percent, and then cumulative percent columns. Your percent and valid percent will be different when you have excluded a response category. But if I had don't know here, then they would look exactly the same. So please, the habit is always to read your valid percentage. Cumulative percentage, what this simply does is it adds these response categories together until it gets 100%, 60.1 plus 23.6 and so forth. So this is an example of an output, a frequency of one categorical variable. I was also able to use this to produce a bar chart as well as a pie chart. Over here, this is an example of where I used a variable age. Age is where I have a scale variable because I captured the ages. In this particular response category, I then do summary statistics with a scale variable. So you'll see here the minimum age was 16, the maximum age was 85, and then it provides me the summary statistics: the mean, the average, the median, the middle point, the mode, the standard deviation, and then I can look at the histogram. What SPSS does do is it does actually provide for me a frequency table for age, but with the number of respondents, do you see how producing a table like this for that many respondents, I'm going to have my table running over 6 or 7 A4 pages. There's just too many. So that's why it becomes more appropriate to present scale variables in the form of summary statistics. Of course, SPSS is not limited to only description then. It also can produce inferential statistics. So descriptive, quite simply, is describing numerical data. It's telling us summary information. Inferential statistics is where we take it one step further. We can test hypotheses. We can see whether those variation in the percentages between each categories in my frequencies is actually statistically significant. And of course, for this, your SPSS and some statistical knowledge becomes incredibly important. You would need to be able to identify between your dependent and independent variables. And your table then becomes a little bit bigger, right? So when you're doing bivariate and multivariate analysis, you can add in a level of inferential analysis as well. I think for just the sake of expediency, I'm not going to go into any more detail, but I have and I will make available to you the presentation examples of some of the things that SPSS can do, where you have bivariate analysis. You're now looking at two variables descriptively, inferentially, as well as then how you would explain, or what does that data mean for a number of various techniques that you are welcome to work through in your own time. Or I would very much encourage you, if this has perhaps interested you in embarking on quantitative research, please do have a look around the workshops and the short courses that are offered at the university. Because they are, I know, at the African Doctoral Academy, but also in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, there are a number of departments offering short courses that staff members and students are welcome to enroll for. I've also just left for you here two readings that I find particularly useful. And a little bit about myself and my contact details. So if you are interested, if you have questions, I have asked our colleagues at the library to please make available to you the presentation. This gives you a little snapshot into the functionality, how to start using SPSS. The N gives you a little bit of a snapshot in what can be done and what you can learn to do in, quite honestly, a week or two. And I'm also happy to provide some resources as to workshops and short courses that you could look into that are really geared towards first-time users, those who are starting from the beginning, developing their questionnaires and capturing data for the very first time. As I've said before, I'm not a statistician, I'm not a maths guru, but I'm so grateful that I have used quantitative data. And it's really changed the type of research that I do. And yeah, I would very much welcome engagement with those of you who are on the edge, thinking about coming over to the dark side, but maybe are lacking in a little bit of confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. That was so good and so informative. One would never know that you can do so many things with SPSS. There's one question from Mr. Stein. Can you elaborate on how SPSS can be used to analyze genomic sequencing data and other diagnostic data?
Yes, yes. So, Mr. Stein, it can definitely be used. What I anticipate, though, is that the type of data you would be using is scale variables. It's just that sequencing data. So from that, you can do pretty much every kind of correlation one could think of, as well as doing some kind of, regression analysis as well. So what I'll do is, for your particular question, I will have a look at just one or two examples, and I've made a note here of your email address. So what I can do is in the next day or two, I'm happy to send you perhaps just an example of how you in your field would be able to process and use that data.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Another question from Ms. Cole. Can SPSS be used for open-ended semi-structured surveys?
It's a two-part question. So short one is no, but I can also show you some cheats. So SPSS likes closed-ended questions because what we need to do is we need to assign artificial response categories to each of those responses. However, what I have found is that quite often we do ask surveys in a way where I would have these closed-ended response categories, but then there might be a, can you elaborate, or can you tell me a little bit more about this? Or where someone is offered an other category and then asked to elaborate. So what I would do then is I would then capture the data in Excel. And what I would do is I would look, because where someone, if you're asking people about, are you happy during your postgraduate studies, you know, and what are the factors that influence that? And it's an open-ended question. What I often find is that the respondents often offer the same responses over and over again. So it might be that you have 300 respondents, but if each of them are saying, I'm struggling, it's too much reading. That's what I'm struggling with. The lack of scholarship opportunities. I don't have an office. Now, those are worded responses, but if they keep repeating themselves, do you see how then you can take an open-ended question and you yourself, from the responses offered, can actually then code that as if they were closed-ended and analyze them empirically.
Okay, thank you, Cindy, for that. So, colleagues, thank you for attending. I hope you learned a lot. You can contact Cindy. You've seen her contact details. We've still got one session to go for today, which is qualitative research, the basics, and Dr. Elizabeth Leroux is going to take us through that. It's going to be a very good session, so you can register in the meantime. We will start at 13:45, and tomorrow we have another 3 sessions on in this research week. And it's let's strive for research excellence in the face of adversity. So if you want to come and have a listen to what we have on offer, you're more than welcome. So I bid you good afternoon and thank you for attending.